There are mansions America celebrates, and then there are mansions America quietly steps around. The Elms belongs to the second category. Rising above the cliffs of Newport with European confidence and mathematical precision. It is one of the most expensive private homes ever built in the United States, yet it is rarely spoken about with the same reverence as its counterparts. This silence is not accidental. It is the first clue. Because the Elms was never meant to inspire affection. It was designed to endure, to dominate quietly, and to survive a future its owner already feared. At first glance, the Elms looks like a triumph. Marble terraces, symmetrical gardens, and a facade modeled after an 18th century French chateau suggest refinement rather than excess. But beneath that elegance lies something colder. The mansion does not invite admiration. It commands distance. Unlike other Gilded Age estates that flaunted wealth openly, the Elms feels restrained, controlled, almost defensive. It was built at a moment when America's elite sensed the ground shifting beneath them, and it shows. By the turn of the 20th century, public resentment toward extreme wealth was growing louder. Industrial fortunes had reached unprecedented heights, while labor unrest, inequality, and political reform threatened the permanence of dynastic power. The era of carefree display was ending. The Elms emerged from this tension. It was not a celebration of success, but a response to anxiety. A fortress disguised as a palace. William Kissam Vanderbilt II did not build the Elms to be loved. He built it to last. Every decision, from its fireproof construction to its invisible service systems, reflected a man who believed wealth must become untouchable to survive. This was not a summer home designed for parties and spectacle. It was a controlled environment, optimized for efficiency, silence, and insulation from the outside world. Yet even as the Elms represented peak old money engineering, it carried the seed of its own erasure. The mansion arrived too late. The society it was meant to protect was already under scrutiny. What once symbolized achievement now suggested imbalance. What once inspired awe now provoked discomfort. The Elms stood complete just as America began questioning whether such places should exist at all. This is why the Elms feels different today. It is not surrounded by scandal or destruction, but by avoidance. It survived while others fell, yet it never reclaimed relevance. Instead, it slipped quietly into the background of American memory, preserved but emotionally disconnected. Not erased by fire or demolition, but by selective forgetting. The story of the Elms is not about decline through ruin. It is about disappearance through discomfort. It asks a difficult question. What happens when a monument to wealth becomes too honest a reflection of inequality? America did not destroy the Elms. It did something more subtle. It stripped it of meaning. And in that quiet act of forgetting, the Elms became something far more revealing than a mansion ever meant to be. William Kissam Vanderbilt II did not inherit confidence the way earlier generations of American elites had. He inherited awareness. By the time he came into his fortune, the Vanderbilt name no longer represented raw ascent, it represented exposure. Railroads had built the dynasty, but they had also made it visible, criticized, and increasingly resented. Wealth on that scale was no longer invisible. And William understood something his predecessors did not. The future would not be kind to families who looked too powerful, too untouchable, too permanent, like his grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who thrived in confrontation and reveled in dominance. William belonged to a quieter, more defensive era of old money. He was methodical, reserved, and deeply concerned with legacy. Not reputation alone, but endurance. His wealth was unquestioned, but its legitimacy was under pressure. The public mood had shifted. Industrial titans were no longer admired unconditionally. They were scrutinized, investigated, challenged. And William watched this transformation closely. The decision to build the Elms was not impulsive. It was calculated. Newport had once been a playground where wealth could perform freely, but even there the atmosphere was changing. Summer cottages grew larger, yet the celebration around them grew thinner. Displays of extravagance began to feel risky. William did not want a house that shouted. He wanted one that absorbed attention without inviting it. The Elms was conceived not as a social weapon, but as a shield. While other mansions competed for attention through spectacle, the Elms competed through control. It reflected a belief that survival depended on removing friction, social, mechanical, and symbolic. Every feature was designed to eliminate vulnerability. Fireproof construction protected against disaster. Advanced engineering protected against failure. Hidden labor systems protected against visibility. This mindset reveals a deeper fear: decline. William Kisham Vanderbilt, too, did not fear poverty. He feared irrelevance. He understood that dynastic power depended not only on money, but on how that money was perceived. The Elms was his answer to a future in which public opinion mattered more than ever before. It was a mansion designed for an age when wealth needed to retreat in order to survive. Yet even as William attempted to insulate himself from change, he could not escape it. The very act of building the Elms placed him in contradiction. The scale of the mansion spoke louder than its restraint. No matter how refined its facade, its existence was undeniable proof of inequality. It represented a concentration of resources that increasingly conflicted with the democratic ideals America claimed to embrace. William's personal life mirrored this tension. He was not a flamboyant socialite nor a political crusader. He preferred structure to chaos, privacy to publicity. The Elms reflected his temperament precisely. It was elegant without warmth, impressive without intimacy. It projected authority, but not joy. The house was not meant to host the future, it was meant to preserve the past. This distinction is critical. The Elms was not aspirational architecture. It was defensive architecture. It was built to maintain distance between the Vanderbilt family and a society they no longer trusted to admire them. The mansion's gardens were symmetrical and controlled, not romantic or spontaneous. Its interiors were formal and deliberate, designed for efficiency rather than indulgence. Even comfort was regulated. The irony is that this attempt at preservation accelerated the very erasure William feared. By retreating from public engagement, the Elms lost its cultural relevance almost immediately. It did not define an era. It arrived as the era was ending. While other Gilded Age mansions became symbols of excess and decadence, the Elms became a symbol of anxiety, a quiet admission that old money no longer felt secure. As progressive reforms gained momentum and calls for wealth redistribution intensified, estates like the Elms became politically uncomfortable. They represented not just success, but imbalance. William could not have predicted how quickly this discomfort would turn into rejection. Taxes rose. Maintenance costs soared. Public sentiment hardened. The logic that justified such estates collapsed faster than the structures themselves ever could. William Kisham Vanderbilt too died before fully witnessing the consequences of this shift. But his intentions were clear. The Elms was never about celebration. It was about control. It was a statement that wealth could be engineered into permanence. What he underestimated was how deeply cultural permission matters. Once society withdraws its approval, no amount of planning can restore it. In retrospect, the Elms reads like a warning written in stone. It marks the moment when America's elite realized that visibility had become a liability. That the age of unchecked admiration was over. William built the Elms to protect his family from decline, but in doing so, he created a monument to the very fear that would define the end of the Gilded Age. The mansion did not fail because it was flawed. It failed because it was honest. Honest about the imbalance it represented. Honest about the insecurity behind its precision. Honest about an elite class retreating from a society it could no longer dominate openly. This is why the Elms feels different from other Newport mansions. It does not sparkle with nostalgia. It stands with restraint. It does not invite fantasy. It invites analysis. William Kisham Vanderbilt too did not build a dream. He built a response. And in that response he revealed more about the decline of old money than any collapse ever could. The Elms was never meant to be remembered as a triumph. It was meant to endure quietly. But endurance without meaning is another form of disappearance. And long before America began forgetting the Elms, William Kissam Vanderbilt II had already sensed that forgetting was coming. The Elms was designed to be seen without being understood. At a distance, it presents itself as calm, balanced, almost restrained. But that restraint is deliberate, calculated, and deeply ideological. Every line, every proportion, every concealed mechanism inside the mansion reflects a single guiding belief that power should function invisibly. The Elms was not built to impress guests in the moment. It was built to convince history that the Vanderbilt presence was inevitable. Architecturally, the Elms draws its inspiration from the French Château d'Asnières, a residence associated not with revolution or romance, but with order. This choice was not aesthetic coincidence. France, before the fall of its aristocracy, represented the most refined version of inherited power the Western world had ever known. By referencing that tradition, the Elms aligned itself with a vision of hierarchy that felt ancient, stable, and beyond dispute. Yet, America was not 18th century France, and this borrowed language would soon feel out of place. Unlike the exuberant excess of earlier Newport mansions, the Elms communicates authority through precision. Its facade is symmetrical to the point of severity. There are no playful flourishes, no indulgent curves. The building does not flirt with the viewer. It stands firm, unmoved, self-contained. This was architecture meant to outlast trends, not follow them. Inside, the philosophy becomes even clearer. The Elms was engineered to operate like a machine disguised as a home. Advanced systems regulated temperature, lighting, and service flow with minimal disruption to the visible environment. Servants moved through hidden corridors and tunnels, ensuring that labor remained unseen. Comfort appeared effortless because effort was removed from sight entirely. This invisibility was the true luxury. Not gold or ornamentation, but frictionless control. The Elms was a place where nothing appeared accidental, because nothing was. Each space existed to support order, not expression. Even beauty was disciplined. The house did not encourage intimacy. Rooms were grand but formal, impressive but emotionally distant. This was not a place designed for personal warmth or spontaneity. It was a controlled environment, optimized for efficiency and predictability. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Power does not explain itself, and it does not adapt. The servant's infrastructure reveals the clearest truth about the Elms. Entire systems existed solely to ensure that elite life appeared natural, unchallenged by the realities that sustained it. Labor was constant, but invisible. This separation between experience and effort mirrored the broader social structure of the Gilded Age. The Elms did not merely reflect inequality, it operationalized it. Yet what once appeared seamless soon became unsettling. As American culture shifted toward transparency and reform, the hidden mechanics of wealth felt increasingly dishonest. The Elms, designed to conceal its workings, became a symbol of the very excess and imbalance the nation began to question. The architectural silence of the Elms, once a strength, turned into a liability. It did not tell a story people wanted to hear. It did not celebrate progress or opportunity. It suggested permanence in a society built on change. In an age increasingly defined by movement, flexibility, and visibility, the Elms felt static. The mansion's technological sophistication only deepened this contradiction. Its advanced systems represented progress, yet they served a fundamentally conservative goal, preserving hierarchy. Innovation existed not to democratize comfort, but to reinforce separation. This irony did not go unnoticed. Visitors often described the Elms as impressive but cold, beautiful but distant. These reactions are not emotional accidents. They are the intended outcome of a design philosophy that valued authority over connection. The house does not invite the viewer inside. It keeps them at a respectful distance, even when physically present. This emotional distance helps explain why the Elms never became beloved. Other mansions inspired fascination or resentment. The Elms inspired detachment. It was too controlled to provoke outrage, too reserved to provoke affection. It existed in a psychological middle ground where erasure became easy dots as the Gilded Age faded. Mansions that told dramatic stories survived in memory. Those that tried to hide their meaning did not. The Elms fell into this category. Its refusal to engage emotionally with the public made it vulnerable to forgetting. Architecture, like narrative, depends on resonance. The Elms refused resonance. It insisted on stability in a world that no longer trusted it. The result was a mansion that survived physically while fading culturally. The irony is that the Elms succeeded perfectly at what it was designed to do. It concealed labor. It minimized chaos. It preserved order. What it could not do was adapt its message. The meaning of restraint changed. What once signaled refinement came to signal withdrawal. The Elms did not collapse under criticism. It simply stopped being defended. And in America, what is not defended is often quietly erased. In the end, the Elm stands as a study in architectural psychology. It reveals how design choices encode fear, ideology, and expectation. It shows how buildings can communicate power without words and how that communication can fail when the audience changes. The mansion did not lose relevance because it aged. It lost relevance because it told the truth too clearly. It showed a vision of wealth that no longer fit the story America wanted to tell about itself. And so the Elms remains precise and silent, a monument to a moment when old money believed invisibility could guarantee survival. It could not. By the time the Elms reached its full social maturity, the world that justified its existence was already beginning to fracture. On the surface, Newport still glittered. Summer seasons continued. Trunks arrived by rail. Footmen opened doors. Champagne flowed across terraces overlooking the Atlantic. But beneath the choreography, something fundamental had shifted. The mansion was no longer part of a rising system. It had become a holdover from a logic that was quietly expiring. The family that built the Elms understood money as permanence. Their fortune had been created through railroads, infrastructure, monopolies that felt as solid as stone. Steel rails crossed the nation. Coal-fueled expansion. Capital, once accumulated, appeared unassailable. The Elms was conceived inside that certainty. It was a house designed for a future, assumed to be endless. No one involved truly imagined a scenario in which such estates would become liabilities rather than triumphs. But American wealth was changing faster than its architecture. Industrial fortunes that once relied on physical assets began facing new forces. Regulation emerged. Labor unions organized. Public scrutiny intensified. The same newspapers that once praised the Vanderbilts now ran exposes on excess and inequality. What had been admired as ambition was recast as greed. The Elms did not change, but the meaning projected onto it did. During the First World War, the mansion's silence grew heavier. While European palaces were requisitioned, bombed, or abandoned, Newport's estates remained intact. That survival, rather than reassuring the public, became a source of discomfort. How could such wealth remain untouched while millions faced rationing, conscription, and loss? The Elms did not answer the question. It simply stood immaculate and unmoved. The social rituals inside the house continued, but with diminishing conviction. Entertaining became more restrained. Guest lists shortened. Conversations shifted from expansion to preservation. The tone was no longer triumphant. It was defensive. The Elms had been built to host a society confident in its dominance. Now it housed a class quietly negotiating its own relevance. Servants noticed the change first. Fewer parties meant fewer hours. Budgets tightened. Repairs were delayed. The invisible machine that kept the house running began to show strain. The systems designed to erase labor now revealed how much labor they required. What once felt effortless began to feel expensive. The Great Depression shattered any remaining illusion of permanence. As banks collapsed and unemployment soared, the Elms transformed from symbol of success into exhibit of excess. Photographs of breadlines appeared alongside images of Newport mansions in the public imagination. The contrast was unavoidable. The question was no longer whether such houses were impressive, But whether they were justifiable, the owners did not lose their wealth overnight, but the narrative turned hostile. Politicians invoked estates like the Elms as evidence of imbalance. Reformers cited them as relics of unchecked capitalism. The mansion became a rhetorical object, used to argue for taxation, redistribution, and oversight. Its walls absorbed criticism they were never designed to withstand. Inside, life became quieter. Entire wings went unused. Rooms built for crowds echoed with absence. The scale that once communicated power now amplified emptiness. The Elms had been engineered to function at full capacity. Operating below that threshold felt unnatural, like a machine idling without purpose. Maintenance costs did not decline with usage. Heating systems still demanded fuel. Roofs still needed repair. Gardens required care regardless of who walked through them. The very features that had defined the mansion's excellence now worked against it. Grandeur became overhead. The idea of selling was unthinkable at first. Estates like the Elms were not commodities in the traditional sense. They were identity made physical. To sell would be to admit a form of defeat. Yet practicality crept in. Heirs faced different realities. New generations did not share the same attachment to Newport seasons or inherited rituals. Their ambitions pointed elsewhere. Unlike earlier mansions that leaned into spectacle, the Elms struggled to reinvent itself emotionally. It could not pivot into nostalgia because it had never embraced warmth. It could not claim public affection because it had never courted it. Its dignity became distance, and distance became irrelevance. During the mid-20th century, America redefined success. Mobility replaced lineage. Suburbia replaced estates. Privacy replaced display. The Elms stood in direct opposition to these values. It represented a fixed hierarchy in a society increasingly obsessed with movement. Its message felt outdated, almost embarrassing. Tourists began to arrive not as admirers but as observers. They walked through rooms with curiosity rather than aspiration. The house became an object of study rather than desire. Guides spoke in past tense. The language of inevitability faded, replaced by the language of history. Preservation efforts emerged not because people wanted to live like the Vanderbilts, but because they wanted proof that such a world had existed. The Elms transitioned from residence to artifact. This shift saved it physically but altered its meaning entirely. It no longer asserted power. It documented it, yet even preservation came with ambivalence. Unlike mansions that captured the public imagination through scandal or tragedy, the Elms offered no dramatic climax. Its decline was quiet, administrative, procedural. Budgets replaced balls. Committees replaced hostesses. The story lacked spectacle, and spectacle is what memory prefers. The irony is that the Elms did exactly what it was built to do. It insulated its occupants from chaos. It buffered them from volatility. It maintained order. What it could not do was teach its successors how to justify that order once belief in it collapsed. By the time cultural attitudes fully shifted, the mansion had already lost its defenders. No one argued passionately for its relevance. No one claimed it represented the future. It existed in a suspended state, preserved but not celebrated, admired but not embraced. The Elms became a lesson without commentary. Visitors sensed its intention but not its urgency. They saw craftsmanship without context, systems without stakes. The house waited for interpretation, but interpretation requires emotional access. The Elms offered very little. What once symbolized control now symbolized retreat. The mansion did not fall because it was attacked. It faded because it no longer spoke the language of power effectively. Influence had moved elsewhere, into boardrooms, media, politics, and technology. Stone walls could not compete. In this sense, the Elms represents a broader truth about old money in America. Wealth that relies on silence and separation struggles when visibility becomes a requirement. The tools of dominance must evolve. Architecture cannot adapt on its own. The mansion stands today impeccably maintained. Its surfaces restored, its systems functional. But its authority is gone. It no longer commands. It demonstrates. It is an answer to a question no one is asking anymore, and that is the quiet tragedy of the Elms. It was not destroyed. It was preserved. Yet preservation stripped it of purpose. The house remains, but the worldview that created it does not. In the end, the Elms did not fail structurally or financially. It failed narratively. It was built to project inevitability in a nation that came to prize reinvention. Once inevitability lost its appeal, the mansion's voice fell silent. What survives is a shell of certainty, perfectly intact, echoing with a confidence that no longer belongs to the present. By the time the Elms entered what should have been its period of quiet continuity, the mansion had already become something fragile, not in structure but in meaning. This was the phase no architect plans for and no dynasty prepares its heirs to manage. The moment when a house outlives the worldview that justified its creation. Section 5 is not about collapse or scandal. It is about erosion. Slow, elegant, almost invisible erosion. The Elms was built to operate inside a closed ecosystem of certainty. Its owners believed that wealth, once accumulated at such scale, would naturally perpetuate itself through inheritance, reputation, and social insulation. But American capitalism was mutating. Fortunes were no longer guaranteed to behave like estates. Markets became volatile. Industries rose and fell within a generation. The idea that money itself could be permanent was quietly disproven. And the Elms felt that shift long before anyone spoke it aloud. As the decades passed, the mansion began to experience a problem its creators never anticipated: succession without conviction. Heirs inherited the house, but not the obsession that had built it. To them, the Elms was not a triumph wrested from chaos. It was a responsibility inherited without context. They had not watched it rise. They had only watched it age. This generational disconnect altered everything. Decisions once guided by pride became guided by practicality. Rooms stopped being refreshed. Entire floors were closed off to reduce staffing costs. What had been designed as a living organism began operating like a museum before anyone officially called it one. The house was still occupied, but no longer animated by belief. Outside the gates, the world grew louder. Newspapers sharpened their language. The ultra-wealthy were no longer protected by reverence. The Elms, once a private fortress, now existed inside a public conversation about inequality, privilege, and excess. The mansion did not defend itself. It had never needed to. But silence, once a shield, became an accusation. Maintenance itself became a philosophical dilemma. Every dollar spent preserving the mansion raised an unspoken question: preserve for whom and for what purpose? Heating systems alone required resources that felt increasingly difficult to justify. The Elms was no longer merely expensive. It was symbolically expensive. Each repair reinforced the narrative that this house represented an old imbalance still being maintained. The social rituals that once justified the estate's scale vanished almost completely. There were no grand summer seasons anymore, no carefully staged displays of dominance disguised as hospitality. Without these rituals, the mansion lost its primary function. Architecture designed for performance becomes awkward when the audience disappears. The Elms began to feel oversized not just physically, but conceptually. Servants, once invisible by design, became fewer and more visible. The illusion of effortless luxury depends on labor that is never acknowledged. As staffing decreased, that illusion collapsed. Guests noticed empty corridors, delayed service, rooms left unused. The house could no longer hide the cost of its own existence. At the same time, American taste shifted decisively. Modernity prized efficiency, transparency, and informality. The Elms represented the opposite: formality without flexibility. Its symmetry felt rigid. Its rituals felt rehearsed. The mansion could not evolve without betraying itself, and so it remained static in a culture obsessed with change. Attempts to reposition the Elms privately were tentative and conflicted. Should it be downsized? Partially closed? Donated? Each option felt like an admission that the old logic had failed. Families who once believed they were stewards of permanence now found themselves negotiating exit strategies from history itself. This is where the Elms diverges from more dramatic stories of old money decline. There was no bankruptcy auction. No scandal forced its hand. No single event marked the end. Instead, the mansion slipped into a liminal state, no longer central, not yet historical. It existed in between, waiting for a decision no one wanted to make. During this period, the house became psychologically heavy. It reminded its owners of expectations they could not fulfill. To maintain the Elms was to pretend that nothing fundamental had changed. To abandon it felt like erasing a lineage. Either choice carried emotional cost. And so indecision became the default. The broader public sensed this hesitation. Estates like the Elms were increasingly perceived as ghosts of an outdated moral framework. They represented a time when wealth could exist without explanation. That time had passed. Now, wealth was expected to justify itself publicly through philanthropy, innovation, or visibility. The Elms offered none of these narratives naturally. When preservationists began to express interest, it was both relief and humiliation. Relief because the burden of upkeep could be shared or transferred. Humiliation because preservation reframed the mansion as an artifact rather than a living assertion of power. Once a house becomes history, it forfeits authority. The transition was gradual, almost polite. Portions of the estate were open to limited tours. Language softened. The house was no longer ours but important. Its value was no longer personal but cultural. This shift altered the emotional ownership completely. The Elms stopped belonging to a family and started belonging to an idea of the past. Visitors walked through rooms not with envy, but with curiosity. They asked how people lived here, not how they could. This distinction matters. Aspiration sustains relevance. Curiosity signals closure. The mansion's future was now tethered to education, not influence. Ironically, preservation stabilized the structure while finalizing its symbolic decline. The Elms would never be demolished, but it would also never rule again. It would exist as evidence, not ambition. The systems still worked, but their purpose had changed. What makes this phase tragic is its quietness. There is no dramatic soundtrack for gradual irrelevance. No headlines announce when a symbol stops functioning. The Elms did not fall. It slipped out of alignment with the nation it once mirrored. America moved forward without it. Wealth reorganized itself into forms less visible and more agile. Power learned to travel light. The Elms, anchored in stone and ritual, could not follow. By the time its identity fully shifted, no one argued anymore about whether it should survive. The debate was settled by indifference. The house remained because it was beautiful, not because it was necessary. And that is the defining tension of this chapter. The Elms endured physically, but surrendered its role as a living institution. It became a monument to a system that assumed continuity and received transformation instead. Section 5 is where the Elms stops shaping history and begins reflecting it. The mansion no longer dictates values. It displays them. Its silence becomes its message. A message about certainty misplaced, about power misunderstood, and about a future no amount of marble could guarantee. What stands at the end of this phase is not a failure of wealth, but a failure of imagination. The Elms was built for a world that did not believe it could end. When that belief dissolved, the house remained immaculate, imposing, and fundamentally out of time. By the time the Elms crossed fully into public consciousness, it no longer belonged to the world that created it. Section 6 marks the moment when the mansion ceased to be a private instrument of power and became a public object of interpretation. This transition did not happen with ceremony. It happened through exposure. Once the gates opened, even partially, the logic that had protected the Elms for decades began to unravel. Public access changed the meaning of every room. Spaces once designed to intimidate subtly now invited scrutiny. Visitors were no longer guests performing social rituals. They were observers searching for answers. They did not ask who owned the house anymore. They asked why it existed at all. This shift transformed the Elms from an assertion into a question. Docents spoke in measured tones about architecture and design, but the subtext was impossible to ignore. People walked through the mansion, carrying modern assumptions about fairness, labor, and excess. They noticed the servant corridors. They noticed how comfort depended on invisibility. What had once been admired as efficiency now read as separation. The Elms began to function as a mirror for national discomfort with old wealth. Unlike newer forms of luxury that could claim innovation or utility, this mansion stood naked in its intent. It existed to concentrate privilege and make it feel natural. That honesty, once a strength, now made it vulnerable. As tourism increased, the house's emotional temperature shifted. Visitors did not envy it the way earlier generations might have. They analyzed it. They dissected it. The Elms became a case study rather than a fantasy. This was not the reaction its builders had anticipated. Preservation introduced a new layer of control, but also a loss of authority. Decisions about the mansion's future were no longer guided by family strategy, but by institutional responsibility. Committees replaced patriarchs. Grant applications replaced inheritance. The language surrounding the house softened, but also hollowed out. Where once the Elms commanded deference, it now requested relevance. Educational framing attempted to contextualize excess rather than celebrate it. Guides emphasized craftsmanship, historical context, and social structure. These narratives were careful, almost defensive, acknowledging discomfort without fully confronting it. The mansion's beauty survived this reframing, but its power did not. Beauty can be admired without submission. Power requires belief. The Elms no longer inspired belief in hierarchy. It inspired contemplation about its consequences. This period exposed the psychological contradiction at the heart of preservation. To save the mansion, institutions had to neutralize its original purpose. They preserved the object by disarming the ideology embedded within it. The Elms could exist only if it no longer meant what it once meant. This disarming process was subtle but thorough. Rooms were reinterpreted. Language evolved. What had been grand became formal. What had been efficient became revealing. The narrative shifted from inevitability to contingency. The mansion no longer represented how the world should work, only how it once did. Yet something resisted this reframing. Visitors still felt the weight of the space. The ceilings were still high. The proportions still disciplined the body. Even stripped of its authority, the Elms retained an ability to shape behavior. People spoke more quietly. They walked more slowly. Architecture remembered what culture tried to forget. This tension created an unease that no amount of educational signage could erase. The house communicated on a level deeper than explanation. It reminded visitors that inequality had once been designed with elegance, and that elegance does not erase intent. The Elms also became a reference point in broader cultural conversations about wealth preservation. Why should structures like this survive when the systems that built them caused harm? The question lingered unanswered in the corridors. Preservation justified itself through history, but history itself was on trial. Unlike ruins, the Elms was too intact to feel harmless. It was not a relic overtaken by nature. It was pristine, controlled, and carefully maintained. Its survival felt intentional, even strategic. This challenged the public to confront whether remembering was an act of responsibility or indulgence. Over time, the mansion's story became inseparable from this debate. It was no longer just about the Vanderbilt era or Gilded Age architecture. It was about how societies choose which symbols deserve continuity. The Elms existed because someone decided it should, and that decision carried moral weight. The house also began to attract a different kind of audience. Scholars, architects, sociologists, and critics studied it not for pleasure but for insight. The Elms became evidence. It testified to a worldview where efficiency served hierarchy and beauty served control. In this role, the mansion gained a new kind of relevance. Not aspirational but instructional. It warned rather than seduced. It demonstrated how easily power disguises itself as order, and how difficult it is to dismantle once embedded in stone. Still, this relevance was fragile. Educational value does not guarantee emotional connection. Visitors left informed, but rarely moved. The Elms taught, but it did not inspire. And inspiration more than preservation determines cultural longevity. As newer generations encountered the mansion, the distance widened further. For those raised in a digital, decentralized world, the Elms felt alien. Its logic was slow, hierarchical, and rigid. It belonged to a tempo that no longer matched modern life. The mansion's silence amplified this disconnect. There was no living family voice to complicate the narrative. No contemporary claim to relevance. The Elms spoke only through interpretation, and interpretation always reflects the present more than the past. What survived was atmosphere, not authority. The house became a stage set for memory rather than a participant in current power dynamics. It existed parallel to society, not within it. This parallel existence is deceptive. It creates the illusion that history can be neatly separated from the present. But the Elms resists that separation. Its continued maintenance requires resources, labor, and justification. It still participates in the economy it supposedly represents only historically. This contradiction fuels quiet resentment. Some see preservation as respect. Others see it as indulgence. The mansion stands at the center of that unresolved argument, unable to defend itself, unable to disappear. Section 6 is where the Elms becomes uncomfortable. Not scandalous, not dramatic, but unsettling. It forces viewers to confront the persistence of symbols long after their moral clarity fades. It asks whether beauty excuses origin and whether survival implies endorsement. The mansion does not answer these questions. It never was designed to. It assumed its right to exist. That assumption no longer holds. And yet, the Elms remains. Clean, composed, and carefully explained. It waits for meaning to be assigned to it by each generation that walks through its doors. Some will see craftsmanship. Some will see excess. Some will see warning. What no one sees anymore is inevitability. The Elms has lost that forever. In this chapter, the mansion completes its transformation from power to paradox. It survives not because it dominates, but because it provokes. It stands not as proof of success, but as evidence of a system that believed permanence was its birthright. The Elms no longer controls the narrative. It is contained by it. And that containment, quiet, polite, and absolute, is the most profound reversal of all. By the time the Elms reached this stage of its existence, it had become something rarer than a preserved mansion. It had become a psychological artifact. Section 7 explores how the house began to live not as a residence, nor even solely as a historical site, but as a mental reference point, a symbol people carried with them long after they left its gates. The Elms no longer shaped behavior through authority. It shaped perception through implication. Visitors arrived with expectations shaped by documentaries, textbooks, and cultural shorthand about the Gilded Age. They anticipated spectacle. Indulgence, perhaps even moral outrage. What they encountered instead was restraint, order, and quiet discipline. That mismatch unsettled them. The Elms did not scream excess. It whispered control. And whispers linger longer than noise. The mansion's emotional power now came from what it withheld rather than what it displayed. Rooms felt curated to the point of denial. Personal traces were minimal. Unlike houses that reveal their occupants through clutter or idiosyncrasy, the Elms revealed only intention. This absence of personality made the space feel institutional, almost corporate despite its age. This quality allowed the mansion to function as a canvas for projection. Visitors filled its silence with their own conclusions. Some saw elegance refined to purity. Others saw an environment stripped of warmth. Both interpretations were valid, and both revealed more about the observer than the house itself thought in academic circles. The Elms began to appear in discussions about spatial power. Scholars pointed to how architecture disciplines bodies, how ceiling height enforces posture, how symmetry controls movement, how invisibility structures labor. The mansion became a textbook example of how environments encode social relationships without a single written rule. This intellectual framing filtered slowly into popular consciousness. The Elms was no longer just a Vanderbilt mansion. It was shorthand for a type of wealth that valued order over intimacy, control over expression. It represented a mindset as much as a material reality. This symbolic role deepened as American society wrestled with new forms of inequality. Technology created fortunes faster than estates ever could. Yet the anxiety surrounding wealth remained. The Elms became a reference point for discussions about whether extreme wealth inevitably isolates its holders. Regardless of era. Unlike modern luxury, which emphasizes openness and customization, the Elms was fixed. Its rigidity made it feel moral rather than fashionable. It suggested that wealth once came with rules enforced by architecture itself. This idea intrigued some and disturbed others. Cultural memory began to abstract the mansion. Films, essays, and lectures referenced it not as a place to visit but as a concept. The Elms came to mean disciplined excess, elegance without affection, beauty without vulnerability. Few of these interpretations required physical accuracy. The symbol had outgrown the building. This abstraction carried risk. When symbols detach from specifics, they become vulnerable to simplification. The Elms was sometimes flattened into a caricature of aristocratic coldness. Nuance disappeared. The lived realities of those who built and maintained the house blurred into stereotype. Yet even these simplifications testified to the mansion's enduring presence. Forgotten places are not distorted. They are ignored. The Elms was still being used to argue, to teach, to warn. Its meaning shifted, but its relevance endured. Internally, preservationists grappled with this evolving identity. Should the mansion be framed as cautionary or celebratory? Should discomfort be acknowledged openly or softened for accessibility? Every interpretive choice influenced how the symbol would solidify in public imagination. There was no neutral option. Silence could be read as endorsement. Critique could be read as apology. The Elms existed in a narrow interpretive corridor, balancing honesty against hospitality. This tension shaped how tours were designed, how exhibits were written, how narratives were paced. Visitors sensed this balancing act. They noticed what was emphasized and what was glossed over. This awareness added another layer of unease. The house was not just controlling space. It was controlling story. At the same time, the mansion inspired a quieter, more personal response. Some visitors felt drawn to its calm. In a chaotic world, the Elms offered stillness. Its order felt soothing rather than oppressive. This reaction complicated moral readings. Control, after all, can feel comforting. This duality made the mansion difficult to categorize. It resisted clear judgment. It neither redeemed nor condemned itself. It existed as evidence of how systems function, leaving interpretation to the viewer. As generational distance increased, emotional responses softened. Younger audiences lacked inherited resentment toward old money. They approached the Elms analytically rather than viscerally. For them, it was less a symbol of injustice and more a case study in design and sociology. This shift altered the mansion's future. Relevance no longer depended on moral outrage. It depended on intellectual utility. The Elms survived because it could be studied, not because it could be loved or hated. Yet intellectual relevance is fragile. It requires continuous reframing. Without active interpretation, symbols fade. The Elms risked becoming an aesthetic object again, beautiful, but inert. Section 7 captures this precarious balance. The mansion stands between memory and meaning, between object and idea. It has survived physical decay, public scrutiny, and cultural shift. But survival is not the same as significance. The Elms no longer dictates values. It provokes questions. It asks how power shapes space, how silence enforces hierarchy, how beauty can coexist with exclusion. These questions are not comfortable, but they are necessary. In this role, the mansion becomes less about the Vanderbilt era and more about the present. Each generation reads its own anxieties into the marble and symmetry. The house adapts not by changing, but by reflecting. This reflective function is its last defense against erasure. As long as the Elms continues to unsettle, It remains alive in cultural consciousness. Comfort is forgettable. Unease is not. Still, the risk remains. If the questions the Elms raises lose urgency, the house could slip back into decorative obscurity. Symbols require friction to survive. Section 7 ends in uncertainty. The mansion has not failed, but it has not resolved. It exists in a suspended state, meaningful yet incomplete, preserved yet unsettled. The Elm stands quietly, absorbing interpretations without responding. It does not correct misconceptions. It does not defend its origin. It allows itself to be used as a tool for thinking. In that silence lies both its strength and its vulnerability. The house has become less a monument to wealth than a mirror held up to those who encounter it. What they see reflected back depends entirely on the questions they bring with them, and as long as those questions continue, the Elms will endure not as a relic of power, but as a reminder of how power once made itself feel permanent. By the time the Elms entered this next phase, its survival was no longer threatened by neglect or controversy, but by something quieter and more dangerous: normalization. Section 8 examines what happens when a symbol that once provoked discomfort becomes familiar. When a structure designed to unsettle power dynamics risks blending into the background of curated history. This is the stage where erasure no longer looks like destruction. It looks like acceptance. Familiarity dulled the edge of the Elms. School groups passed through its halls with worksheets and time limits. Tourists photographed ceilings, staircases, and gardens, then moved on. The house became part of an itinerary rather than a confrontation. When a place is scheduled, timed, and explained efficiently, it loses the capacity to disrupt. The Elms was in danger of becoming consumable. This transformation was subtle. Nothing about the mansion itself changed. The marble remained cool. The symmetry remained exact. The silence remained heavy. What changed was the way people entered the space. They arrived prepared. They knew what they were supposed to see. Surprise vanished, and with it, vulnerability. The danger of this stage lies in how easily meaning becomes aesthetic. When discomfort is expected, it becomes manageable. Visitors learn to admire without questioning, to listen without absorbing. The Elms risked becoming another beautiful backdrop in Instagrammed. Summarized and forgotten. Institutions responded by refining narratives, but refinement often meant simplification. Complex histories were compressed into digestible explanations. Moral tension was acknowledged, then smoothed. The mansion's contradictions were mentioned but not allowed to linger. In trying to remain accessible, interpretation risked becoming anesthetic. This is where preservation and preservationism diverge. Preserving a structure is not the same as preserving its capacity to disturb. The Elms survived physically, but its psychological sharpness required active protection. Without it, the mansion would remain intact but empty of consequence. Cultural trends accelerated this risk. The modern appetite for content favors clarity over ambiguity. Audiences want conclusions, not unresolved tension. But the Elms does not offer conclusions. It offers conditions. It shows how power once organized itself spatially and assumed moral neutrality. This lesson resists packaging. As attention spans shortened, the mansion's slow impact became a liability. Its story does not unfold quickly. It accumulates. It requires silence, patience, and reflection, qualities increasingly rare. The Elms began to feel out of sync, not just historically, but temporally. At the same time, nostalgia crept in. For some, the mansion represented craftsmanship lost to modern minimalism. They admired the permanence, the order, the sense of mastery. This admiration risked detaching form from context. Beauty, when isolated, becomes misleading. This nostalgic reading softened critique. The Elms was rebranded implicitly as a monument to excellence rather than a system. Craftsmanship replaced ideology as the dominant lens. While not incorrect, this framing allowed viewers to appreciate without interrogating. The house itself encouraged this misreading. Its discipline feels virtuous. Its restraint feels responsible. Unlike flamboyant excess, the Elms does not embarrass itself. This composure invites forgiveness. It tempts viewers to believe that elegance equals ethics. Section 8 confronts this temptation. It asks whether calm authority is more dangerous than obvious extravagance. Whether systems that appear orderly are harder to challenge because they do not announce their violence. The Elms did not rely on spectacle. It relied on normalization. It made hierarchy feel logical, even benevolent. That is why its quiet persistence matters. The danger was never demolition. It was forgetting what the calm was built to protect. As the mansion settled into institutional routine, its presence in cultural conversation waned. It was referenced less in debates about inequality and more in discussions of design. This shift did not mean the questions were resolved. It meant they were deferred. Deferred questions accumulate interest. They return later, sharper. The Elms remained ready for that return, even if no one noticed. Internally, curators and historians struggled with fatigue. How many times can the same tensions be explained before they lose urgency? How do you keep a house dangerous without alienating its audience? There were no easy answers. Some experimented with reframing tours around labor rather than owners, space rather than story, silence rather than speech. These efforts were uneven, sometimes resisted. Visitors often prefer comfort to confrontation. The Elms demanded the opposite. This resistance revealed a deeper truth. Erasure does not require hostility. It requires convenience. When a place becomes easy to consume, it becomes easy to dismiss. The Elms hovered at this edge, yet the house itself resisted complete domestication. There were moments, unexpected pauses when visitors felt unsettled despite preparation. A corridor that felt too narrow. A ceiling that felt too high. A realization that comfort was engineered, not natural. These moments could not be scripted away. They reminded visitors that architecture works on the body before the mind. No amount of explanation can fully neutralize spatial power. The Elms still disciplined posture, pace and tone. It still whispered its original logic to anyone willing to listen. This is why the mansion never fully faded. Even normalized, it retained a residue of unease. The challenge was whether that unease would be recognized or ignored. Section 8 argues that this stage is the most precarious in the life of any historic symbol. Not when it is hated, not when it is neglected, but when it is accepted without engagement. The Elms stood at risk of becoming polite history, acknowledged, respected and safely irrelevant. A fate more final than destruction, yet something interrupted that slide. External events, economic crises, renewed conversations about inequality. Cultural reassessments of wealth pulled attention back towards structures like the Elms. The questions it embodied resurfaced with urgency. Suddenly, the mansion felt contemporary again. Not because it changed, but because society did. What once seemed distant began to echo present anxieties. The Elms re-entered the conversation not as nostalgia, but as precedent. This return was uneven but significant. The house regained friction. Visitors arrived with sharper questions. They noticed what had previously been overlooked. The normalization cracked. Section 8 ends here, at the edge of reawakening. The Elms has not been erased, but neither has it been fully understood. It exists in cycles of attention and neglect, critique and comfort. Its survival depends on tension. As long as the house resists easy consumption, it remains alive as a cultural force. The moment it becomes only beautiful, it disappears. The Elms waits in that tension. Silent, balanced, and unresolved. It has outlasted scandal, neglect, and nostalgia. Now it faces its most subtle threat, being too easy to accept. Whether it resists that fate depends not on the mansion, but on the willingness of each generation to sit with discomfort rather than move past it. And that choice, quiet, individual, and recurring, is the real battleground of the Elms' future. By the time the Elms reached this penultimate chapter, its story was no longer anchored in the past alone. Section 9 examines the moment when the mansion begins to intersect directly with the present, when historical symbols stop being safely historical and start colliding with contemporary anxieties about wealth, memory, and responsibility. This is where the Elms ceases to be a lesson confined to textbooks and becomes a pressure point in modern Cultural debates. The renewed scrutiny did not arrive suddenly. It built gradually, carried by economic uncertainty, rising inequality, and a growing discomfort with inherited privilege. As public conversations sharpened, structures like the Elms were no longer treated as neutral artifacts. They were re-evaluated as participants in a long continuum of power that had never fully dissolved. Visitors returned with different eyes. They were no longer content to hear how the house was built. They wanted to know why it was protected, who benefited from its preservation, and what narratives were still being privileged by its survival. The mansion, once passive, now found itself implicated in ongoing arguments about justice and representation. This shift placed preservation under moral examination. The question was no longer whether the Elms was historically important, but whether historical importance alone justified continued investment. In an era where resources felt scarce and inequities felt urgent, maintaining symbols of extreme wealth invited scrutiny. Defenders of preservation emphasized education. They argued that places like the Elms offer tangible lessons about how inequality was structured and normalized. Without them, history risks becoming abstract and sanitized. Critics countered that preservation often aestheticizes harm, allowing visitors to admire systems that should instead be challenged. The Elms stood at the center of this unresolved tension. It was neither innocent nor actively culpable. It did not advocate for its own survival. Yet its continued presence required active choice. Someone, somewhere, decided each year that this mansion deserved care. This realization altered how people experienced the space. The house no longer felt static. It felt negotiated. Each restored surface represented a contemporary decision layered onto a historical one. The Elms became a palimpsest of values, old and new, coexisting uncomfortably. Cultural creators began to engage with the mansion differently. Writers, filmmakers, and scholars used it as shorthand for institutional wealth that outlives accountability. The Elms appeared less as a location and more as an argument. Its image circulated not to celebrate but to interrogate. This circulation amplified its symbolic weight. The mansion was no longer confined to Newport or to guided tours. It entered digital discourse detached from physical experience. People who had never walked its halls formed opinions about what it represented. The Elms became portable, its meaning refracted through commentary rather than architecture. Detachment intensified polarization. Without the moderating effect of physical presence, interpretations hardened. For some, the Elms was proof that extreme wealth always seeks permanence. For others, it was simply a masterpiece of design unfairly burdened with modern guilt. These opposing views rarely met in dialogue. They existed in parallel, reinforcing the mansion's status as a contested symbol. The Elms did not resolve arguments. It provoked them. Inside the institution responsible for its care, these debates translated into practical dilemmas. How should tours address modern inequality without collapsing into moral instruction? How much responsibility does a historic site bear for contemporary interpretation? There were no precedents, only pressures. Some approaches leaned into transparency. They foregrounded labor histories, financial scale, and social exclusion. Others emphasized neutrality, presenting facts without overt commentary. Each approach drew criticism from opposite sides. The Elms could not satisfy all expectations simultaneously. This impossibility revealed something essential. The mansion was never neutral. It was built to enforce a worldview. Attempting to present it without values only concealed that fact. Neutrality, in this context, became another form of choice. Section 9 also explores how the Elms intersects with present-day architecture and wealth. Modern luxury homes emphasize openness, sustainability, and personalization. Yet the underlying impulse to separate, to control, to endure remains familiar. The Elms began to look less like an anomaly and more like an ancestor. This realization unsettled visitors. The distance between past and present narrowed. The mansion no longer felt safely obsolete. It felt relevant in ways that were uncomfortable. This realization unsettled visitors. The distance between past and present narrowed. The mansion no longer felt safely obsolete. It felt relevant in ways that were uncomfortable. The Elms reminded audiences that systems do not vanish when their symbols age. They adapt. They learn to speak new languages. The mansion's endurance became a metaphor for how privilege evolves rather than disappears at the same time. The house also revealed limits. Its rigidity contrasted sharply with the fluidity of modern power. Wealth today often avoids permanence, preferring mobility and opacity. In this sense, the Elms exposed an outdated strategy. It showed what happens when power anchors itself too visibly. This duality complicated interpretation. Was the Elms a warning or a relic? A lesson or distraction? It could be all of these at once. Public engagement deepened but grew more fragmented. Some visitors came seeking confirmation of critique. Others came defensively, ready to protect what they saw as cultural heritage. The mansion became a site of emotional projection as much as intellectual inquiry. Yet despite polarization, one thing was clear. Indifference had ended. The Elms mattered again, not because it inspired admiration, but because it demanded positioning. People could no longer pass through without forming an opinion. This renewed relevance carried risk. Symbols under scrutiny can become targets. Cause emerged questioning whether maintaining such a stage perpetuated inequality. Others warned that erasing them would erase evidence of how inequality functioned. The Elms stood between these impulses. Destroying it would simplify history. Preserving it uncritically would distort it. The challenge lay in holding complexity without collapsing into paralysis. Section 9 captures this moment of exposure. The mansion is fully visible, not just architecturally but morally. Its existence is no longer taken for granted. It must be justified repeatedly in public. In the present tense, this constant justification exhausts institutions and audiences alike. Fatigue sets in. Debates recycle. The risk emerges that engagement will burn out, replaced once again by quiet acceptance. Yet the memory of scrutiny lingers. Even when attention shifts, the questions remain embedded. The Elms cannot return to innocence. It has been seen too clearly. In this way, the mansion's story mirrors broader cultural reckoning. Once systems are questioned openly, they cannot rely on silence again. They must adapt or risk rejection. The Elms adapts not by changing its walls, but by absorbing interpretation. It survives by becoming a site of dialogue rather than declaration. This survival is fragile, contingent on continued willingness to confront discomfort. Section 9 does not resolve whether this is enough. It documents the strain of relevance. The mansion stands but under pressure. Its future depends on how society negotiates memory and accountability. What is clear is that the Elms has crossed a threshold. It is no longer merely preserved. It is actively contested. Its meaning is no longer inherited. It is argued. This argument is the mansion's present condition. It lives inside disagreement. It persists because people care enough to debate its value. As this chapter closes, the Elms exist not as an answer, but as a provocation. It forces confrontation with the long shadow of wealth and the choices societies make about what to carry forward. The mansion waits, as it always has, composed and silent. But the silence no longer protects it. It amplifies the questions echoing around it. And those questions about power, memory, and responsibility are no longer historical. They are immediate. In its final chapter, the Elms no longer stands as a house to be explained, defended, or even debated in isolation. Section 10 considers what remains after scrutiny, reinterpretation, and cultural reckoning have run their course. This is not a conclusion in the traditional sense. There is no resolution waiting behind the marble doors. Instead, there is a reckoning with endurance itself, what it means for a symbol of concentrated power to survive into a future that no longer agrees with the assumptions that built it. The Elms endures, not because it won an argument, but because it absorbed them. Each generation layered its anxieties onto the structure, and the structure remained. That endurance forces an uncomfortable recognition. Some systems are not dismantled by exposure alone. They persist through adaptation, recontextualization, and patience. The Elms demonstrates this quietly, without resistance, without apology. By this stage, the mansion's original purpose has fully dissolved. It no longer organizes society around it. It no longer commands reverence. But it has not become harmless. Instead, it has entered a third state, neither power nor relic but reference. It exists to be returned to whenever questions about wealth, permanence, and memory resurface. This role is deceptively passive. Reference shapes thought. When people search for precedent, for tangible examples of how inequality once structured daily life, the Elms answers. It offers scale. It offers silence. It offers proof that power once believed itself stable enough to carve certainty into stone. The house now operates as a long lens. It compresses time. Standing in its halls, visitors experience a century of belief systems at once. They see ambition hardened into architecture, then softened by interpretation. The past does not feel distant here. It feels adjacent. This adjacency complicates moral clarity. The Elms does not present villains or heroes. It presents a system functioning exactly as intended. That is its most unsettling legacy. Nothing about the mansion is accidental. It did not fail. It succeeded, and in succeeding, it revealed the cost of success built on separation. As societies grapple with how to remember unequal pasts, the Elms becomes a test case. Do we preserve symbols of imbalance to confront them, or does preservation itself reinforce the imbalance? The mansion refuses to resolve this dilemma. It embodies it. Attempts to extract a single lesson from the Elms always fall short. The house resists simplification. It cannot be reduced to a warning without losing its specificity, nor celebrated without distortion. It demands nuance, and nuance is expensive. It requires time, attention, and discomfort. This demand is why the Elms remains vulnerable. Its survival depends on institutions and audiences willing to resist the urge for easy narratives. The moment it is framed as resolved history, it loses its function. The danger is not forgetting its name, but forgetting its tension. In this final section, the mansion's quiet presence feels heavier than ever. Not because it dominates, but because it persists. It outlives trends, debates, and cultural moods. It waits. Waiting is not neutral. It allows meaning to return when conditions change. The Elms is weighted through admiration, neglect, critique, and normalization. It waits now for whatever questions the future will bring. Those questions are already forming. As wealth concentrates again, as architecture once more becomes a marker of separation, the Elms re-enters relevance without effort. It does not need to advertise itself. History repeats softly. The mansion's gardens still follow their disciplined geometry. Paths guide movement subtly, without instruction. Even outdoors, control remains invisible. This continuity reminds visitors that design shapes behavior long after intention fades. The Elms does not teach through narration alone. It teaches through embodiment. To walk through it is to feel hierarchy in the body's slowed steps, lowered voices, constrained gestures. These sensations do not disappear when the tour ends. They linger. This lingering is the mansion's final influence. It operates beneath consciousness, shaping intuition rather than argument. It suggests that power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it organizes the room and waits for compliance. Understanding this does not dismantle it, but it changes how power is recognized elsewhere. That recognition may be the Elms' most valuable contribution. In this sense, the mansion's endurance becomes ethical rather than ideological. It exists not to justify its origins, but to expose their mechanics. It survives as a diagnostic tool, yet even this framing is provisional. The future may decide otherwise. Cultural priorities shift. Resources tighten. Attention moves on. The Elms could one day slip back into obscurity, not erased, but unattended. If that happens, it will not be because its story ended, but because the questions it raises stopped feeling urgent. That would say more about the future than the past. Section 10 closes without closure. The Elms remains unresolved, as it must. Resolution would imply mastery over history, and history resists mastery. What remains is a structure that outlasted belief, absorbed critique, and now stands as a quiet constant in a landscape of change. It does not demand judgment. It invites awareness. The mansion's greatest legacy is not what it was, but what it continues to ask. Who decides what deserves permanence? What does preservation protect, memory or comfort? When does remembering become complicity? The Elms offers no answers. It offers itself, and in that offering lies its final unsettling power.